A retired Navy SEAL was only passing through a snowy Montana town when his German shepherd stopped for a woman everyone else had learned not to see. She wasn't begging, and she wasn't asking for help, but the cold had already begun to take more from her than warmth. What started as one small act of kindness became a journey into grief, dignity, and a place she had not dared return to for years. An old chapel stood above the town, holding an unfinished window and a memory too heavy to carry alone, and somewhere between the winter light, the silence, and the loyalty of one faithful dog, broken hearts began to move again. This is a story about staying, about second chances, and about the quiet ways God can bring people home. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, or share your thoughts after the story. And please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you more stories like this. The morning light over Belle Crane was too clean for sorrow. It poured over the little Montana town in sheets of white gold, touching the roofs, the frozen road shoulders, the church steeple in the distance, and the drifts piled against split-rail fences with a brightness that almost felt indecent. Snow should have looked lonely. Instead, it looked polished, almost ceremonial, as if the whole town had been laid out under glass. Gideon Hale drove into that light with both hands steady on the wheel. At 57, he still had the body of a man who had once belonged to exacting systems and never fully escaped them. He wore a winter green jacket zipped clean to the throat, black jeans, and old combat boots darkened at the soles by road salt and melted snow. Nothing about him was decorative. He had long ago stripped his life down to what could be packed, repaired, or replaced. The truck suited him for that reason. So did the road. Beside him, Brass lifted his head. The German shepherd had been asleep most of the morning, if the word asleep could ever truly apply to a dog like him. Even sprawled against the passenger seat, Brass carried an alertness in his long frame, as though rest was merely another form of readiness. His black and tan coat had begun to silver faintly around the muzzle, but there was nothing soft about him. He was broad-chested, deep-eyed, and deliberate in every movement, a dog who never wasted effort pretending to be friendlier than he was. Gideon glanced at him once, then back at the road. "Almost through," he said. He was not speaking to reassure the dog. He was speaking to fill the cab with something other than silence. Silence had changed for him over the years. In younger days it had been useful, a thing you wore like camouflage. Later it became habit, and lately, though he did not use words like lately unless forced, it had begun to feel more like a room he had locked from the inside. Belle Crane was not his destination. Wyoming was. A short winter contract, cold weather preparedness, private security training for a company that wanted former military men to make ordinary people feel harder to break. It would pay well enough. It would end quickly. It would require nothing of him except competence. That had once sounded like freedom. Now it merely sounded familiar. On the dashboard sat a folded envelope he had not opened in 11 days. His younger sister's handwriting crossed the front in dark blue ink, firm and impatient even from a distance. Gideon had carried it from motel to gas station to roadside diner across 2 states without once breaking the seal. It was not that he feared bad news. It was worse than that. He suspected it contained the kind of ordinary truth he had spent years outrunning. Something about family, or age, or the slow insult of being needed in ways discipline could not solve. He kept his eyes on the road and drove past the hardware store, the shuttered florist, the public library with snow feathered along its steps. Then Brass made a sound. Not a bark, not even a growl, just a low vibration deep in his chest, the sort of sound that seemed to begin in instinct long before it reached the throat. Gideon's hand tightened on the wheel. Brass was looking right, toward an old bus stop near the edge of town where the road bent toward the lake. The shelter was little more than a roof on metal posts with 2 side panels of scratched plexiglass. A place built for waiting, not comfort. Half buried in drifted snow. Empty at first glance. Then Gideon saw her. An elderly woman sat on the bench beneath the shelter roof with a small tin box in her lap, and both gloved hands wrapped around it as though it held either heat or memory. She was not bundled properly for the cold. Her coat was dark wool, once good and probably expensive, but too thin for this kind of morning. Snow had dampened the hems. Her boots were wet through at the toes. Yet she sat very straight, not slumped, not pleading, not trying to catch anyone's eye. Waiting, perhaps, or refusing to collapse in public. Gideon drove past her by 20 yards before the feeling in his chest became annoying enough to name. He exhaled once through his nose, muttered something that was not quite a curse, and pulled the truck to the shoulder. Brass was already standing by the time the engine idled down. "Stay," Gideon said automatically. The dog did not move toward the door, but he did not sit back down either. He watched. Gideon stepped out into the cold. It hit him cleanly. Sharp air, bright snow glare, the smell of pine and distant lake water trapped beneath ice. Belle Crane looked the way postcards lied about winter looking. Beautiful, orderly, untouched. The kind of beauty that made suffering seem somehow inappropriate, like a stain on fresh linen. He crossed the snow-packed shoulder and approached the bus shelter from the open side. The woman looked at him only when his shadow fell across the bench. Up close, she seemed older than he had first thought, perhaps in her 70s, with a narrow face and pale eyes that held themselves with surprising steadiness. Her hair was silver and pinned back badly, not from carelessness but from numb fingers. She was not frail in the flimsy sense. She had the spare, weathered look of a woman who had lived long enough to outlast softness. "You all right, ma'am?" Gideon asked. Her gaze moved over him in one quick, assessing sweep. The jacket, the boots, the posture, the truck behind him, the dog still visible through the windshield. "No," she said, "but that is not a request." The answer landed between them crisp as broken ice. Gideon almost smiled despite himself. "Bus coming?" "Not for hours." "You waiting for someone?" "No." "Then why are you sitting out here?" That took a second longer. The woman adjusted her grip on the tin box. "Because this shelter has a roof," she said. "And because I preferred not to freeze in my car where no one might notice for a while." There it was. Not confession, not quite, but enough. Gideon glanced toward the small parking strip behind the shelter. An old sedan sat there under a dusting of snow, one tire half sunk where the plow had shoved the last ridge of ice aside. "You sleeping in it?" She gave him a look that was almost insulted. Not successfully. That was the moment he understood she was not homeless in the shapeless way people use the word when they wanted to avoid specificity. She was recently displaced. Recently cold. Recently pushed past some line she had not expected to cross. There was still order in her speech, pride in the way she held her shoulders, anger and reserve. Those things did not survive unchanged forever. "What's your name?" he asked. The pause this time was deliberate. "Eleanor Wren." "I'm Gideon Hale." "I had not planned on introducing myself today, Mr. Hale." "No reason you should have." Something flickered at the corner of her mouth. Not amusement, more like recognition that he had answered without patronizing her. Behind him, the truck door clicked. Gideon turned sharply. Brass had opened nothing, of course. Gideon had left the passenger window cracked. The dog had simply pressed his weight against it until it lowered enough for him to nose his way out. Now he crossed the snow toward the shelter in a line so calm it made Gideon more uneasy than sudden movement would have. Brass. Gideon's voice hardened. Back. The dog did not obey. Eleanor watched him come with an expression Gideon could not yet read. Wariness, certainly, but not fear. Brass stopped just outside arm's reach and sat down in the snow facing her. He did not whine. He did not thrust his head into her lap. He simply held still, ears forward, amber-brown eyes fixed on her face, as if he had noticed something essential and would not be talked out of it. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The town seemed to recede around them. The bright road, the blue lake beyond the trees, the high winter sky. All of it widened into silence. Then Eleanor lowered one hand from the tin box, not toward Gideon, toward the dog. She did not touch him at first. Her fingers hovered a breath above his head. Brass remained motionless. When at last her hand came to rest lightly between his ears, the change in her face was so small, most people would have missed it. A loosening around the mouth, a softening at the eyes. Not happiness. More dangerous than that. Relief. It lasted only a second. Then she pulled her hand back as though she had broken some private rule. Gideon felt something shift inside the morning. "You should be somewhere warm," he said. "I am aware of winter. There's a diner back down the road. I'm not hungry. That wasn't the point." Eleanor looked at him again, and this time he saw the fatigue beneath the intelligence. Not confusion, not surrender. Just the exhaustion of someone who had spent too many hours maintaining dignity in bad conditions. "I have no interest," she said carefully, "in being gathered up." The words struck him harder than they should have, because he knew what she meant. Not just physically, she meant sorted, redirected, filed into the appropriate holding place by some practical stranger with a capable tone and a timetable. He had done versions of that all his life, sometimes with weapons involved, sometimes with clipboards, sometimes only with his own distance. "I'm not gathering," he said. "What are you doing, then?" He looked at Brass, still seated, still watching her with that impossible steadiness. He should have said, passing through, being decent for 5 minutes. "None of this is mine." Instead, he heard himself answer, "Stopping." The word surprised him enough that he almost took it back. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Wind scraped loose snow over the road in glittering ribbons. Somewhere across town, a metal sign knocked once against a post. At last, she looked down at the tin box in her lap. Its corners were dented. The paint, once blue perhaps, had worn thin along the edges. She held it with a care that made Gideon think of heirlooms, or ashes, or medicine. Something small enough to be protected, important enough not to be surrendered. He did not ask about it. Not yet. "There's a place called Quinn's 2 blocks back," he said. "Coffee, heat, no speeches. And then you decide what comes after." She said nothing. Gideon waited. That, more than anything, seemed to matter. He did not reach for her arm, did not insist, did not tell her what kind of help she ought to accept. Brass stood only when she stood, as if the movement belonged to her first. Eleanor rose carefully. The first shift of weight betrayed how cold she really was. One leg stiffened. Her breath caught once in the air. Gideon noticed and pretended not to. "Can you walk?" "Yes," she said, with the offended dignity of a queen asked whether she knew how to sit. "Good." He took a step back to let her move first. Brass fell in beside her rather than beside Gideon. That should not have bothered him. Yet somehow it did. They crossed the road slowly under a winter sky bright enough to make every footprint look temporary. Gideon walked half a pace behind, close enough to catch her if the ice took her balance, far enough not to insult her by hovering. Brass matched her stride as if he had known it for years. When they reached the truck, Gideon opened the passenger side rear door. Eleanor looked at it, then at him. "I am not climbing into the back like luggage." His mouth twitched. "Front seat, then. And the dog, he'll manage." Brass, without being told, jumped into the back. For the first time, something almost like dry amusement touched her expression. It vanished quickly, but Gideon saw it. He helped her with the door only at the very last inch, when the frozen hinge resisted. Then he walked around the hood, climbed back behind the wheel, and started the truck. The heater coughed warm air in uncertain bursts. Nobody spoke for the first block. But the silence had changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by something fragile and uninvited, like a lamp newly lit in an abandoned room. Gideon kept his eyes on the road ahead. This was only breakfast, he told himself. Heat, 15 minutes. Then he would go. Yet, even before Quinn's diner came into view through the winter glare, he knew the morning had already shifted in a way he did not understand. And men like him had spent whole lives pretending not to notice when a road quietly stopped being the same road they had entered. Quinn's diner had the kind of warmth that did not arrive all at once. It met them first at the windows, where the glass had fogged pale at the edges from coffee steam and cooking heat. Then, at the door, when Gideon pulled it open and a bell overhead gave a bright, almost cheerful chime that sounded too small to matter and somehow still did. Then, in the air itself, black coffee, frying butter, cinnamon, wool coats drying by the radiator, and that particular smell old diners carried when they had survived enough winters to stop pretending they were temporary places. The room was narrow and longer than it first appeared, with a row of booths along one wall and a counter on the other. Nothing inside it matched perfectly. The stools had been recovered in 2 different shades of red vinyl. A sugar jar sat beside a stack of Piper napkins, printed with faded green holly left over from December. The place looked repaired rather than designed, and for reasons Gideon could not have explained, that made it feel more trustworthy. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 40s with chestnut hair twisted into a knot that had given up trying to be neat 3 hours ago. She had flour dusting one sleeve of her dark sweater, strong wrists, a broad, steady face, and the sort of eyes that missed very little while pretending not to pry. When she looked up and saw Eleanor, something in her expression changed, not shock, not pity, just recognition followed immediately by decision. "Back booth," she said, already reaching for a pot of coffee, near the heater. There was no performance in it, no soft voice for the injured, no exclamation designed to embarrass. She spoke as if assigning weather to its correct place. Eleanor stopped just inside the door. The heat had reddened her face unevenly, and Gideon could see now what the cold had done to her. It had not broken her composure, but it had drained something from her bones. She looked as though standing required a private argument she no longer had energy to hide. "I can sit anywhere," she said. The woman gave her one measured glance. "I know. Sit there anyway." For the first time since the bus shelter, Eleanor did not immediately answer back. Gideon helped with nothing but the chair. Even that he did with care, touching the wooden back only after she had already chosen to sit. Brass padded after them, paused silent on the old tile, then paused beside the booth as if waiting to see which human claim mattered most. Eleanor settled first. The dog lay down along the outer edge rather than under the table, leaving himself half between her and the aisle. The woman came over with coffee for Gideon, hot water with lemon for Eleanor, and without asking, a plate with 2 buttered slices of toast. "I didn't order," Eleanor said. "No," the woman replied, "but you haven't eaten." Gideon looked up. The woman's face remained open, almost calm, but he could see now what held the place together. She was not soft. She was exact about kindness. "Mara Quinn," she said, turning toward him at last. "You're not from here." "Passing through," Gideon said. Something in her mouth suggested she had heard that kind of sentence before, and never trusted it much. "Of course you are." Gideon gave the ghost of a nod. "Gideon Hale." Her eyes moved briefly to Brass. "And the lieutenant?" "He answers to Brass." Mara's gaze flicked once to Eleanor and back, as if taking the full measure of what had entered her diner without needing any of them to explain it out loud. "He can stay if he doesn't start a union." Brass rested his head on his paws and did not dignify the remark with movement. Mara left them alone after that, which Gideon respected more than she would have known. The diner had begun to fill in small winter ways. 2 men in work jackets argued quietly over the county plow routes. A woman near the window stirred cream into coffee she seemed too distracted to drink. Somewhere behind the kitchen pass-through, someone dropped a spoon and swore with feeling. Life, ordinary and unceremonious, moved around their booth. Eleanor kept both hands wrapped around the glass mug of hot water. She did not touch the toast. "You should eat," Gideon said. "You are developing a managerial tone." "I had it before breakfast. I can imagine." He leaned back against the booth, careful not to crowd the table. "You'll imagine less if you take a bite." Her eyes lifted to his. Pale, tired, annoyed, still sharp. "Do you always speak to strangers as if keeping them alive is a matter of scheduling?" Gideon considered that. "Not strangers." "Then what am I?" He looked at Brass, who had not moved from his quiet post beside the booth. "A complication," he said. To his surprise, that almost drew a smile from her. Not because it was charming, because it was honest. She took 1 piece of toast at last and broke off a corner. Mara reappeared a few minutes later with a bowl of oatmeal and set it down in front of Eleanor, then placed scrambled eggs and bacon near Gideon without being asked. "I said I didn't want," Eleanor began. "I know," Mara said. "I also know you used to say the same thing about pie and then eat half of mine while telling me I cut the apples too thick." This time, Eleanor did look up sharply. The silence between them changed shape. It was not the silence of strangers. It was the more difficult kind, people who had once known one another well enough to skip politeness and had since learned to live around the absence. "You remember incorrectly," Eleanor said. "No," Mara replied. "I remember selectively." Then she walked away before either of them could decide what that had meant. Gideon watched Eleanor take in the room, not greedily, not nervously, but with a peculiar caution, as if warmth itself might ask something of her she was not ready to give. "You know her," he said. "She knows many people. It is one of her more dangerous habits." "That wasn't what I asked." Eleanor let a spoon rest against the edge of the oatmeal without using it. "This is a small town. Knowledge becomes a kind of weather. One lives under it. And you'd rather not. I would rather not be discussed. That ship may have left the harbor when you spent the morning freezing at a bus stop." Her jaw tightened at that, but not from humiliation, from the fact of being seen too clearly by someone she had not permitted to see her at all. Gideon took a sip of coffee and let the quiet settle. The chapter of his life in which he would have pressed harder was long over. Or perhaps not over, merely embarrassing in retrospect. He knew how to extract information, knew how to fill silence until people broke, and called the breaking honesty. But this was not that kind of room. And Eleanor Wren, he was beginning to understand, had survived enough winters of one kind or another to recognize pressure, even when it came dressed as concern. So he ate his eggs. Brass stayed where he was. The diner hummed around them. It was Eleanor who spoke first. "The car won't start reliably," she said, "if that is what you are wondering." Gideon looked up. "It turns over," she continued, eyes on the table. "Sometimes, then not. The heater stopped doing anything useful 3 nights ago. The passenger side window no longer closes completely. I slept in it twice because the cabin was colder." "The cabin?" She gave a small nod, still not looking at him. Mara returned just then with a fresh pot and refilled Gideon's mug. "She's got a place out by the lake road," she said, because clearly she had decided they were now all participating in the same conversation, whether invited or not. "Old plumbing, older stove. It gave up last week when the cold came down hard." Eleanor's mouth flattened. "I am sitting right here." "And still choosing to leave out all the useful parts," Mara said. "That remains one of your more tiring qualities." She leaned a hip against the back of the booth, arms folded. Up close, Gideon could see the tiredness tucked into the corners of her eyes. Not fragility, simply the wear of a woman who opened before dawn and had probably spent years feeding people without ever calling herself generous. "How long?" Gideon asked. Mara answered before Eleanor could avoid it. 2 nights in the car, maybe part of a third." "I did not ask you to keep count," Eleanor said. "No," Mara said quietly. "You didn't ask much of anyone." That landed harder than Gideon had expected. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what passed across Eleanor's face after them. Not guilt, not shame in the ordinary sense. Something older. The look of a person who had practiced not kneading in public until the habit became a shelter more dangerous than the cold. A man at the counter laughed too loudly at something, and the sound broke the moment before it could deepen further. Gideon wiped his hands on a napkin. "There a shelter in town?" "Yes," Mara said. "No," said Eleanor at the same time. Gideon turned to her. "You don't even know what I was going to ask." "I know perfectly well what practical men ask when faced with human inconvenience. That's one way to put it." "An accurate one." Mara straightened. "The county warming center's open in winter. 3 cots. A microwave that sounds like it resents its own existence. 2 decent blankets if no one's stolen them, but—" "But?" Gideon asked. Mara's eyes slid to Brass, then back. "They don't take dogs in the sleeping room." That was enough by itself to change the air. Brass had not moved, but Gideon felt Eleanor's attention shift toward him before she did. It was subtle, a glance not yet completed, the kind of reflex that told the truth faster than speech. "There are kennels behind the building," Mara added. "Temporary." "No," Eleanor said at once. Gideon had not expected the speed of it. Mara, however, seemed unsurprised. "I know." Eleanor placed the spoon down with exaggerated care. "I will not sleep under a blanket while he is put outside in a wire box." "He is not your dog," Gideon said before he could stop himself. "No," she replied. "But he came with me." The sentence should not have meant anything. It should have been merely situational. Yet something in Gideon resisted it on instinct, not because it was untrue, but because of how naturally she had said it. Brass raised his head and looked at her. For a second, the whole booth tightened around that quiet exchange. Then something small and almost absurd happened. Mara set down a chipped ceramic bowl, scooped a little plain oatmeal into it from Eleanor's untouched dish, and slid it toward the dog. Brass glanced at it, then at Gideon, then back at Eleanor. He did not eat. "Go on," Gideon said. The dog remained still, Eleanor stared at him. Is he ill? No? Stubborn? Usually with purpose. The moment stretched. Then, tentative as if she were handling a wild thing rather than a domestic one, Eleanor bent down and nudged the bowl 2 inches closer to Brass with her fingertips. Only then did the dog lower his head and eat. Mara made no comment. Gideon did not either. But he felt the shift. Not grand, not mystical, not the sort of thing sensible people narrated later as revelation. Simply a dog making a choice, and a woman who had spent days refusing comfort watching it happen as though some private law of the universe had just been amended without consulting her. After that, Eleanor ate half the oatmeal. They stayed longer than Gideon had intended. The diner settled into late morning. Sunlight moved across the floorboards in cold, bright bands. Mara brought more hot water without asking, and at some point draped a faded quilt over the back of Eleanor's booth, as if she were adjusting furniture in her own house. It was close to noon when Gideon finally said, "Someone should look at that cabin." Eleanor set down her mug. "No. Why not?" "Because I said so." "That isn't a reason. It's an announcement." "It is both." Mara sighed softly. "Eleanor?" "No." Her voice sharpened now, not loud but precise. "I know what comes next. Someone checks the stove, then the pipes. Then the county hears I am not managing well. Then there are forms, assessments, offers to relocate me somewhere efficient and humiliating." "No one said anything about relocation," Gideon replied, "because you have known me for 80 minutes. She was not wrong, which made answering harder. Mara took a dish towel from her shoulder and folded it once. "It's not only pride, then." Eleanor turned toward the window. That was when Gideon noticed where she was looking. Not at the road, not at her car. Beyond the diner's front glass, beyond the low roofs and the whitened parking lot and the line of dark firs near the lake, a rise of land lifted toward the far edge of town. On it stood the old chapel. Small from this distance, weather dark, its steeple narrower than the church at the center of town, almost hidden among the trees. The look on Eleanor's face altered so quietly it might have been mistaken for fatigue, but it wasn't. It was recognition mixed with resistance. The expression of someone hearing her own name spoken in a voice she had spent years trying not to remember. "Who does that place belong to?" Gideon asked, though he had a feeling the question was already larger than property. Mara followed his gaze and answered more softly than before. "St. Bartholomew's, been shut most of the year. Joel Mercer keeps the keys. Roof still holds, barely." Eleanor said nothing. Brass had finished the last of the oatmeal and returned to his spot beside her. He did not look toward the chapel. He looked at her. Gideon did the same. At length, Eleanor spoke without turning back from the window. "Some buildings," she said, "do not forgive being abandoned." The words hung there, thin and strange, and far more intimate than anything she had said yet. Mara went still beside the booth. Gideon did not ask what she meant, not because he lacked curiosity, because he heard in her voice the edge of something that was not ready to be named in daylight over dishes and coffee steam. Outside, the winter sun kept shining over Belle Crane with that same indecent purity it had worn all morning, as if the world had no obligation to reflect what it held. Inside, heat pressed softly at the windows. Eleanor sat with her hands around the empty mug, looking toward the chapel on the hill, as though it had reached across years to lay a hand against the center of her chest. And Gideon, who had meant only to stop long enough for warmth and breakfast, found himself no closer to leaving than when he had first pulled off the road. The clinic sat on the north side of Belle Crane, in a low white building that looked less like medicine than persistence. Its parking lot had been plowed badly and salted twice, which Gideon noticed because the ridges of brown snow along the curbs told him someone had expected more weather than the sky was currently willing to admit. The cold had sharpened again after lunch. The beautiful light remained, hard and polished over everything, but now the wind off the lake had teeth in it. Eleanor objected to the clinic on principle before they even turned into the lot. "I am not ill," she said from the passenger seat. "No," Gideon replied, easing the truck into a space nearest the door. "You're cold, underslept, and trying to turn that into a philosophy." Brass, in the back seat, made a soft sound that might have been agreement, or merely the settling of a large dog who had learned that human beings often argued while moving toward the same door. Eleanor gave Gideon a sideways look. "I dislike how quickly you have become conversational." "You dislike accuracy. That's different." She almost answered, then thought better of spending the energy. That, more than any complaint, told him the trip had been necessary. Inside, the clinic was spare and warm in a way Quinn's diner had not been. No nostalgia lived here, no smell of cinnamon, no cracked vinyl, no comfort pretending to be casual. The heat came from vents near the floor. The walls were painted the color of watered milk. On a side table lay 3 hunting magazines, a church bulletin, and a children's coloring book with 1 crayon snapped in half. Someone had decorated the reception desk with a mug full of fake pine sprigs and a string of white lights that had been left up past Christmas without apology. The receptionist glanced up, took in Gideon, the dog, and the woman at his side, and made the kind of face people made when they saw complexity arrive all at once. Before she could say anything, a voice came from the hallway. "He can stay if he stays quiet." The woman who emerged was in her 50s, lean and straight-backed, with iron-gray hair cut close at the jaw, and reading glasses hanging by a cord against her scrub top. Nothing about Dr. Helen Sutter suggested softness, yet there was something in the way she took in a room that made it clear she saw more than most people wanted seen. Her face held no cosmetics, no fuss, and very little patience for ceremony. "Eleanor," she said, not warmly, but not coldly either. "You look terrible." Eleanor drew herself up. "Your bedside manner remains medieval. And your timing remains poor." Helen's gaze shifted to Gideon. "You brought her in?" "She came willingly," he said. Eleanor turned toward him. "That is an extravagant interpretation." Helen's eyes moved from one to the other, then to Brass, who had already settled against the wall as if he had an appointment of his own. "Fine. However it happened, it happened. Come back." The examination room was small, bright, and honest. Gideon liked honest rooms. They did not seduce anyone into false ideas. A narrow, paper-covered table, stainless steel tray, cabinets with worn handles, a blood pressure cuff that had likely outlived 3 renovations. Helen motioned Eleanor into the chair instead of onto the table, and that alone earned something like respect from Gideon. People who knew how to preserve dignity in practical ways were rarer than they should have been. Helen checked her pulse first, then her blood pressure, then the backs of her hands. "When did you last sleep indoors?" she asked. Eleanor said nothing. Helen glanced at Gideon. He answered because the silence had become needlessly theatrical. 2 nights in the car, maybe part of a 3rd. Cabin's heating failed. Helen's jaw tightened, though only a fraction. "Feet?" "I beg your pardon?" Eleanor asked. "Your feet, are they numb?" Eleanor hesitated. "Occasionally." Helen crouched, not delicately, and examined the wet boots with the expression of a woman who had spent years watching people confuse stubbornness with resilience. "Take them off." "I would rather not." "So would I," Helen said, "which is why I'm asking now instead of after your pride turns into infection." Gideon looked away then, giving Eleanor what privacy the room could manage. He busied himself with the coat hook, Brass's leash, the window. Outside, the sky was a white-blue sheet stretched over the parking lot. Belle Crane looked almost innocent from here. Behind him, he heard fabric, breath, the rustle of paper on the exam chair. Helen worked without drama. That, too, Gideon respected. She did not tisk over the redness in Eleanor's toes. She did not sigh at the stiffness in her joints. She made notes in a short, sharp hand and asked practical questions in a tone that made dishonesty feel inefficient. Any dizziness? Not unless people talk too much. Appetite? Intermittent. Meaning? Meaning I dislike this questionnaire. Helen gave up on courtesy altogether and looked to Gideon again. Has she eaten? At the diner. How much? Enough to be offended by it. That almost drew a snort from Helen. Almost. When she was done, she stepped back and folded her arms. You're not at the point where I can justify forcing anything on you, she said to Eleanor. But let's be plain. Another couple of nights of this and the decision stops being yours. Exposure doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates. So does exhaustion. Eleanor put her boots back on with slow, irritated movements. I have no intention of dying theatrically. No one ever does. The sentence sat heavily in the clean room. It was Gideon who broke it. What about the cabin? Helen's expression shifted slightly, not toward reluctance, but calculation. Someone needs to look at it. Stove, pipes, wiring, windows, at minimum. No, Eleanor said. Helen turned to her. That answer is growing stale. It remains serviceable. It remains foolish. The two women looked at each other in a way that told Gideon more than anything either of them had yet said aloud. They were not friends in the easy sense. They were people with a history of speaking honestly enough to wound and returning anyway. Helen removed her glasses and cleaned them with the edge of her sleeve. You are not being asked to surrender the deed to your life, Eleanor. You are being asked to admit that cold is not improved by conviction. Eleanor's mouth thinned. You all think this is about weather. And you think it isn't? Gideon asked. That made her look at him fully. For a second, he expected anger. What he saw instead was weariness sharpened into self-protection, the sort of look a person wore when the facts had long since stopped being the dangerous part. Helen, perhaps sensing the room tightening, changed course. She opened a drawer and took out a pair of thick wool socks, then set them on the counter beside Eleanor without comment. It was such a small thing that it landed harder than a lecture might have. Eleanor stared at them. I am not Charity. No, Helen said. You are a woman with cold feet. The socks do not care what word you use for it. Brass rose then and crossed the room, not urgently, simply because Eleanor's stillness had changed. He sat beside her chair and laid his chin lightly against her knee. Something moved through her face too quickly to name. She did not pet him at once. Instead, she looked at Helen and asked, in a voice much quieter than before, Is it that obvious? The room went very still. Helen did not answer immediately. That restraint gave the question the dignity it deserved. Yes, she said at last, to anyone who knows what cold and fatigue look like. No to those who have trained themselves not to see. Gideon felt that somewhere under the ribs. He had spent half his adult life among people trained to see everything that might kill a body. Much less time among people willing to notice what diminished a life without leaving marks obvious enough to report. Helen moved to her desk and wrote something on a prescription pad, then tore the page off and handed it to Gideon. This is not medicine, she said. It's Wade Fenner's number. He does stoves, old pipes, and whatever the town forgot to fix 20 years ago. If he complains, tell him I said he already owes me for the chainsaw incident." Gideon took the paper. Eleanor looked offended on principle. "I did not consent to a committee." "Nobody's forming one," Helen said. "We're preventing a funeral. It's a narrower goal." When they left the exam room, Helen caught Gideon alone by the hallway coat rack, while Eleanor stood at the desk pretending not to need help with her scarf. "She's not confused," Helen said quietly. "That matters. Don't let anyone turn her into a case file just because she's tired." "I hadn't planned to. She'll make it easy to forget that. She's good at turning concern into a trespass if it gets too close." Gideon slipped the paper into his jacket pocket. "You know her well." Helen's eyes moved past him to Eleanor and Brass waiting near the door. "I know the outline. In towns this size, outline becomes its own species of intimacy." She paused. "There are reasons she doesn't want the county involved. Most of them aren't practical." Before Gideon could ask what that meant, Eleanor had already finished with the scarf and was heading for the door as though anyone who lingered in medical buildings deserved what happened next. The wind had picked up by the time they stepped outside. Brass jumped into the truck bed and then back into the cab in one fluid movement, shaking cold from his coat. Eleanor stood with one hand on the doorframe, looking toward the lake road without seeming to. Gideon opened his mouth to suggest going back to Quinn's. Instead, Eleanor said, "The library is still open on Tuesdays." He blinked. "What?" She kept looking ahead. "The North Side Reading Room. Nora Bellum manages it now. If you insist on learning things without permission, that would be one route." It was not quite consent, but it was the first time she had offered him a direction instead of a refusal. He studied her profile. Silver hair pulled back carelessly, thin mouth, eyes pale enough to look almost colorless in this light. She seemed diminished by cold, and yet somehow more dangerous now than at the bus shelter, because dignity had returned just enough to fight with. "What would I be learning?" he asked. Eleanor opened the passenger door but did not get in immediately. "That depends on whether Belle Crane kept its records better than its conscience." Then, to his surprise, she lifted the dented tin box from her lap and held it toward him. Not completely, only far enough that he had to choose whether to take it. He did. It was lighter than he expected, and colder than the air. For one suspended second he thought she might change her mind. Instead she said, "Open it." Inside lay several pieces of colored glass wrapped in an old dish towel, their edges dulled by age but not by care. A pencil, sharpened by knife rather than machine. A narrow strip of lead came. Two folded papers, yellowed at the creases. And beneath them all, a small square of blue glass so deep in color it seemed to hold evening inside it. Gideon looked up. The expression on Eleanor's face was difficult to read. Not trust, not exactly. Something more reluctant, and therefore perhaps more real. "I did not keep those because I enjoy clutter," she said. "No," he answered. Brass had come around to stand beside them, close enough that his shoulder touched the back of Gideon's leg. The dog's attention remained not on the box but on Eleanor, as if this, too, was a kind of balance that might fail if no one witnessed it carefully. Gideon closed the lid and handed the box back. He did not ask about the glass. Not yet, that restraint seemed to matter. Eleanor took the box and drew it in against her coat. "The chapel on the hill," she said after a moment. "It's called St. Bartholomew's. If Joel Mercer still has the keys, then the east side window may still be there." The wind moved through the parking lot in a long, bright sweep, skimming loose snow over the asphalt like sand over stone. Gideon heard the words, but what stayed with him was the way she had said east side window, not casually, not sentimentally, the way one might refer to a grave, or a door never closed properly, or a name still capable of drawing blood after years of silence. He opened the passenger door for her. This time she did not protest the gesture. Once she was inside, Gideon walked around to the driver's side more slowly than before. The truck started with a rough turn and settled. Neither of them spoke for the first minute. Then Gideon glanced once at the road leading south toward Wyoming, bright and open and familiar in all the ways he had once mistaken for safety. He turned the wheel instead toward town, toward the library, toward the chapel he had not yet seen up close, toward whatever waited in Belle Crane wearing the shape of old glass and older refusals. Beside him, Eleanor sat with the tin box in both hands and looked straight ahead. Brass lay down behind them with a heavy exhale, as though some invisible line had just been crossed, and there was no point pretending otherwise. By the time the library roof came into view beyond the bare cottonwoods, Gideon understood one thing clearly. This had ceased to be a matter of weather, and whatever had been abandoned in Belle Crane had not, in fact, stayed buried merely because the town had learned to walk around it. The town looked harmless enough to be trusted. That was the offense of it. By the time Gideon parked outside the library, the afternoon had thinned into a hard, white light that made every roofline look precise and every shadow look honest. Belle Crane wore winter beautifully. It had the composure of places that knew how to survive cold without ever admitting what the cold cost. The snow along the sidewalks had been shoveled into neat ridges. The pines around the square stood dark and still. Even the boarded florist window looked less abandoned than merely asleep. Gideon had spent years learning that tidy surfaces were not evidence of anything. Eleanor remained in the truck while he crossed the street to the library with Brass at his heel. He had expected her to refuse the idea outright. Instead, she had grown quieter, which was not the same as agreement but often more dangerous. Silence in some people meant thought. In others, it meant withdrawal. He had not yet learned which kind hers was. The north reading room was warm, bright, and underused. Sun pooled over long wooden tables and rows of shelves that held local histories, repair manuals, hymnals, almanacs, and the kind of donated novels people read more out of loyalty to pages than to plot. At the far desk sat Nora Bellum, a woman in her early 50s with silver threaded through her dark hair and wire-rimmed glasses low on her nose. She had the composed posture of someone who spent her days among records, and therefore trusted memory only when it could be checked twice. Her sweater was the color of dry cedar bark, and her voice, when she looked up, was as soft as paper turning. "Can I help you?" Gideon hesitated, suddenly aware that he had entered this town like a man who believed every locked thing opened if he stood still enough in front of it. "I'm looking for records on St. Bartholomew's," he said. "Old photographs, maybe building files, anything on the east window." Nora's gaze moved once to Brass, then back to Gideon, and sharpened very slightly. "You're not from here." That seems to be the local consensus. It's usually accurate. She leaned back a fraction. "And what brings an out-of-towner to our least funded shelf?" Gideon thought of Eleanor waiting in the truck with the tin box in her lap, guarding glass and silence with equal care. "An invitation," he said. That was enough, apparently. Something in Nora's expression shifted. Not warmth, exactly, but a reduction in distance. She rose and led him through 2 narrow aisles to a cabinet of flat drawers near the back wall. She moved with quiet efficiency, not hurried, not slow. The kind of person who had long ago accepted that people came to records only when something mattered more than comfort. "St. Bartholomew's burned a little in 1986, she said, while sliding open a drawer. "Roof damage in the annex, smoke in the south transept, no deaths, much gossip. The real trouble came later. Funding ran thin, attendance thinner. Then people began dying or moving away in the ordinary respectable ways that drain a town without making a scene. She laid several folders on the table between them. Newspaper clippings, donation ledgers, black and white photographs on stiff paper. One showed the chapel in summer, smaller than Gideon had imagined, its stone steps lined with women in hats after some long-ago service. Another showed the interior, flooded with colored light from a window the camera could not capture properly because the brightness overwhelmed the film. "There," Nora said, tapping the edge of one print. "East Side." Gideon bent over the table. Even in grayscale, the workmanship was obvious. Not grand in the cathedral sense, more intimate than that. Panels of branchwork and sky, winter-thin birches lifting through a geometry of pale lead lines, and at the center a circle of light made to resemble dawn breaking over water. "Who made it?" he asked, though he already knew part of the answer. Nora studied him for a beat, as if deciding how much of Belle Crane's buried weather he had earned. Eleanor Wren and Irene Vale, mostly. Eleanor had the eye. Irene had the patience for solder and repair. Together they made a room feel less lonely than it had any right to. Gideon said nothing. Nora opened another folder and drew out a program from a winter fundraiser 21 years old. St. Bartholomew's Restoration Evening. Names listed in faded black ink. Donors, musicians, volunteers. Halfway down the page, Eleanor Wren, lead glass artist. And beneath that, in smaller print, Thomas Wren, event logistics. He stared at the second name longer than he meant to. Nora noticed. Librarians noticed most things that passed for nothing. "You know the outline already," she said. "Not much of it. That may be a mercy." Before he could ask more, Brass rose from where he had been lying by the radiator and went to the front windows. He did not bark. He simply stood there, weight forward, watching the street with a concentration that made Gideon's neck tighten. He crossed the room quickly and looked out. The truck was still there. The passenger seat was not occupied. For a second, his brain refused the obvious out of irritation rather than disbelief. Then the irritation sharpened into something colder. When did she leave? Nora came to the window and frowned. "I didn't see her come in." "She didn't." He was already moving before the sentence finished. Outside, the air felt thinner than it had 10 minutes ago. Gideon scanned the square, the hardware store, the diner windows, the church road. No sign of her. No silver hair, no dark coat. No rigid posture moving against the glare. Only the town going on with itself. Pickup trucks. A boy on a bicycle too small for the snow. A man lifting feed sacks from a flatbed with slow, practiced grunts. Brass jumped down from the library steps and turned. Not toward the diner or the parked sedan, but uphill, toward St. Bartholomew's. "Damn it," Gideon muttered, and went after him. The climb to the chapel was not long, but in the cold it felt exposed. The path wound above town through fir and bare cottonwoods, the snow crusted hard where sun had struck it earlier, and soft where shadow kept the world from thawing. Brass moved ahead in a line that was not frantic but certain. Gideon hated certainty in dogs when it arrived before certainty in men. Halfway up, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Wyoming, the contract coordinator. He looked at the screen, then silenced it without answering. At the top of the rise stood the chapel, smaller up close and more wounded. St. Bartholomew's had once been sturdy in the way hand-built things could be sturdy without pride. Now the stone had darkened with weather, the wood trim had lifted in places, and the narrow steeple leaned just enough to remind anyone looking that time was also a form of pressure. Snow had gathered along the lower steps and against the side wall where the wind drove it. Eleanor sat on the third step, one hand braced against the cold stone, the tin box beside her. She had not fallen. That somehow made the sight worse. She was simply there, as if she had chosen the place with a clarity that did not include comfort in its calculations. Brass reached her first and stopped a few feet away. He did not press against her. He stood watchful, head low, waiting for permission no one had asked him to seek. Gideon came the rest of the way on anger because anger was easier to carry uphill than fear. "What the hell was that?" he said. Eleanor did not look up. "A walk." "You left without a word." "Yes. You had no business walking up here alone in this weather." That made her lift her head. "This weather," she repeated very softly, "has less to do with it than you think." He exhaled hard through his nose and forced his voice down. The chapel amplified everything. Even quiet sounded like accusation. "I went into the library for 10 minutes. "You went into the library to begin arranging me?" The words struck with more force because part of him knew at once she was not entirely wrong. "I was trying to help." "No," she said. "You were trying to make the problem legible." He stared at her. Below them, Bell Crane lay in clean winter light, orderly as a postcard. From up here it looked almost unreal, like a town children might build with blocks and patience. The distance made ordinary life obscene. Smoke from chimneys. The glint of sun on windshields. Someone's laundry, stiff on a line behind a house. Gideon heard his own voice before he had decided on it. "And what would you prefer? That I leave you to freeze because your pride finds the alternatives inelegant?" Eleanor rose too quickly. The motion nearly undid her. Her knees faltered. One hand shot to the railing, and Brass moved at once, not lunging, not frantic, simply stepping close enough to lend his body if gravity finished what weakness had begun. Gideon caught himself half a step forward. Eleanor steadied. When she spoke, the anger in her voice had changed register. It was no longer directed at him alone. It was old anger, old enough to have lost heat and become shape. "You think I don't know what practical men do when something becomes inconvenient," she said. "They sort it, they stabilize it. They decide where it belongs. They mean well. They always mean well. I'm not trying to sort you. Aren't you?" He had no good answer to that, because he had already spoken to Mara, asked about the warming center, taken Helen's note for Wade Fenner, gone to the library without asking what she wanted found there or whether she wanted him looking at all. Every step had felt reasonable. Every step had also moved her life an inch farther from her hands. The silence stretched between them, cut only by the dry whisper of wind moving snow across stone. Then Eleanor sat back down, suddenly, as if whatever had held her upright had spent itself. When she spoke again, the voice was smaller, but not weaker, just stripped. "We argued here," she said. Gideon did not move. "Not exactly here," she corrected after a moment, looking toward the side path beyond the chapel door. "There, near the east wall." Brass lowered himself onto the step below her, close enough that the back of her coat brushed his shoulder. Eleanor kept her eyes on the weathered stone. "He wanted to sell the house," she said. "Not because he was faithless, because he was tired. The repairs were always something. The winter costs, the roof, the pipes, the 1,000 ordinary humiliations of maintaining a life after it stops being held up by youth." She swallowed once. "I told him leaving would be the same as admitting we had spent years loving the wrong place." Gideon listened. That was all. No questions. No soothing. Just the discipline of staying still while another person crossed ground she had not crossed aloud in years. He had pain in his chest already, Eleanor went on. Not dramatic. Men rarely announce themselves dramatically before they collapse. He said he needed air. I said fine. He walked out. I let him. A pause. I let him because I wanted to win the argument before I wanted to follow him. Her gloved fingers tightened around the edge of the tin box. I told myself I would go after him in a minute. Then another. Then another. The words came more slowly now, as if she were lifting them by hand. They found him, not far from the side steps. He had fallen before he could get back to the door. Nothing moved in the bright air except a line of loose snow skimming across the yard. Gideon had seen grief in many forms: loud, private, drunk, disciplined, theatrical, embarrassed. This was none of those. This was grief after long compression, no longer fluid enough for tears, too permanent to be surprised by itself. I have spent 14 years, Eleanor said, knowing that 1 minute can be an act of character. He looked at the chapel windows. Most were plain and dark. On the east side, partly obscured by the angle, he could just make out where one panel had been boarded over long ago. The contract coordinator called again. The phone vibrated in his pocket and would not stop. He took it out, stared at the name on the screen, and for the first time in a long while understood that a life could become dishonest through obedience just as easily as through neglect. He answered. "Mr. Hale," came the brisk voice, "we need confirmation you'll make Cheyenne by Thursday morning. We've had another trainer back out and I'm not coming," Gideon said. A beat. "Excuse me? I said I'm not coming." The woman on the other end recovered professionally. "This is extremely short notice." "Yes. We've already allocated housing and then unallocated." He ended the call before the sentence finished and stood for a moment with the phone still in his hand. Eleanor looked at him, not with gratitude, which would have made the thing easier to misunderstand, but with something far more unsettling. Recognition. As if she knew exactly what it cost certain men to change direction after they had convinced themselves motion was the same as purpose. "You shouldn't have done that for me," she said. He put the phone away. "It wasn't only for you." That, too, was honest. Below them, the town remained bright, composed, ordinary. The kind of place where no one watching from a kitchen window would have guessed that on the chapel steps above the road, 2 older strangers and a dog had just altered the shape of a winter. Gideon looked at the boarded east window again. He understood now why she had said this was not about weather. And Eleanor, sitting rigid beside the old stone wall with her dead husband's silence still living between the steps and the snow, looked less like a woman resisting help than like someone who had built her life around a sentence she never stopped serving. Brass remained where he was, pressed gently against the line of her leg, as if he had taken a post there and meant to keep it. For a long while, none of them spoke. The afternoon light tilted lower over Bell Crane, and the chapel held there quiet without mercy, without comfort, and without once looking away. Morning came without tenderness, but it came clear. The sky over Bell Crane held that hard winter blue that made every line in the world look sharper than it felt. Snow on the chapel grounds had crusted overnight into a skin thin enough to break under a boot and thick enough to resent it. Gideon stood in the yard behind Quinn's diner, splitting a stack of old pine kindling Mara had dragged out from the shed, more for the rhythm than the wood. The axe rose and fell, each clean strike a way of keeping his thoughts from collecting too fast in one place. Behind him, the kitchen vent hummed. Somewhere inside, dishes clinked. Brass lay near the back steps, head on his paws, watching Gideon with the patient disapproval of a dog who knew when a man was working for practical reasons and when he was trying to chop his own mind into manageable pieces. The door opened. "You don't have to punish the firewood," Mara said. She stood under the awning in a dark wool coat with a faded apron still tied over it, as if the morning had caught her midway between roles and she had not bothered to choose. Her hair was pinned up badly, and the cold had flushed her cheeks a little. She held 2 mugs in one hand and passed one down to Gideon without ceremony. He took it. Coffee. Strong enough to qualify as advice. "I'm not punishing it." "No?" She glanced at the neatly split row by the wall. "Then you've developed very intense feelings about combustion." He gave a brief sound that could have been a laugh if someone had tilted it differently. Mara looked past him toward Brass. "She's awake." Gideon didn't ask who. That part no longer needed naming. Eleanor had slept in the small room off Mara's storage hall, under 2 wool blankets and a quilt that probably belonged to no one, and therefore to everyone. She had not thanked anyone for it. Mara had seemed to consider that a sign of improvement. Gideon set the mug down on the chopping block and leaned the axe aside. "How is she?" "Hungry enough to be rude." Mara took a sip from her own cup. "Color's better." Then, after a beat, "Still armed with opinions?" That was never in doubt. "No," Mara said. "The body was the concern. The opinions have always had shocking stamina." They stood in the cold a moment longer, not quite companionably, not awkwardly either. Belle Crane was waking in small noises. A truck on Main Street. A dog somewhere beyond the fence. Wind moving through the firs with a sound like paper being handled by careful hands. Gideon picked up his coffee again. "I need to ask her something." Mara tipped her head. "You planning to ask or organize?" That landed clean. He looked at her. Mara's face held no accusation in it, only the blunt steadiness of someone who had watched enough decent intentions go wrong to stop treating intention as proof. "Ask," he said. "Good." She nudged the back door open with her elbow. "Try not to sound like you're briefing a rescue team." Inside, the room off the back hall was narrow but warm. A small window looked toward the alley, and the morning light turned the frost on the glass into white lace. Eleanor sat in the chair by the radiator with her feet wrapped in Helen Sutter's wool socks, a shawl around her shoulders, and the dented tin box on her lap as if sleep had not persuaded her to loosen her grip on anything important. Her hair was pinned back more neatly today. That alone told Gideon something had shifted, though he was not yet sure into which direction. Brass entered first and went directly to her side. Eleanor set one hand on his head without looking at him. "Traitor," she said mildly. "You were meant to be neutral." Brass accepted the charge in silence. Gideon stayed near the door. He had learned enough in 24 hours to know that distance could be its own form of respect. "I need to ask you something," he said. Eleanor looked up. "That sentence has become your most dangerous habit." "I'm working on several. I'm sure that has kept many women alert." He let that pass. The air between them had changed since the chapel. Not softened exactly, but rebalanced. There were fewer defenses being mistaken for structure. He took a breath. "If there is one thing you want finished before this winter ends, what is it?" The room seemed to still around the question. No lecture followed it. No suggestion. No solution disguised as generosity. Just the question. Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the tin box. For a moment, Gideon thought she might refuse to answer, simply because the question had been shaped too carefully. Then she looked past him, not at the door, not at the alley, but somewhere farther than both. "The east window," she said. He did not move. "At St. Bartholomew's," she added, as though the first answer might have been mistaken for metaphor. The center panel was never completed. Why not? Her mouth thinned, but not in anger this time, in concentration. Because after Thomas died, people had the appalling courtesy not to ask me back. And I had the worst discourtesy of being relieved. Brass lifted his head slightly, sensing the current in her voice. Eleanor went on. The framing was done. Most of the branch work, the side fields, the central circle was only mocked in on paper. It was meant to be dawn over water. She gave the smallest shrug. Then grief arrived with all its excellent scheduling. Gideon held himself still. Can it be finished? A long silence. Yes, she said at last. Not by me alone. That was the first true opening. Not permission, not trust, nothing so sentimental. But the plain admission that a thing could not be restored without more than one pair of hands. For a woman like Eleanor Wren, it might have been the most radical sentence she had spoken in years. Mara appeared in the doorway, carrying a plate with toast, and preserving the fiction that she had not been listening with religious attention. Well, she said, that sounds refreshingly inconvenient. Eleanor gave her a flat look. I was hoping for a simpler death. You'll have to disappoint yourself. Gideon almost smiled. Then the practical shape of the thing began forming in his mind. Not as command, for once, but as structure waiting to be offered and refused in the correct order. Irene Vale, he said. The name altered the room. Eleanor did not flinch. She did something harder. She went very still. Mara set the plate down on the side table. I can find her. No, Eleanor said at once. Gideon looked from one woman to the other. Mara leaned against the frame. You can refuse if you like. That doesn't make her less necessary. I know what it makes, Eleanor said. Do you? Mara asked softly. There was history there, thick and unphotogenic, not a theatrical falling out. Something meaner in older age. Years of silence laid carefully over affection until no one remembered where the first injury had actually begun. Gideon said, You said the window can't be finished alone. Eleanor's gaze shifted to him. I said, it can't be finished by me alone. That is not the same thing as wanting witnesses. Too bad, Mara said. You live in a town. That earned her a look sharp enough to cut cloth, but Mara had clearly survived worse weather. By noon, they were driving back toward St. Bartholomew's with a paper sack of sandwiches, a thermos, and a list Mara had written in a hand so forceful it seemed to resent the paper. Joel Mercer, Irene Vale, Nora Bellum, Wade Fenner, Ron Dugan. Gideon glanced at the list once at a stop sign. This feels suspiciously like organizing. Mara, in the passenger seat this time while Eleanor and Brass occupied the back, said, It's only organizing if you do it without listening. Today I'm calling it logistics with manners. The first stop was the chapel. Joel Mercer was already there by the time they arrived, as if churches trained a certain kind of man to appear quietly before being summoned twice. He was in his early 60s, tall in the slightly stooped way of people who had spent years bending over books and grief without enough stretching between the two. His hair had gone mostly white around the temples, and his coat looked like it had been brushed more by weather than by hand. He carried the keys to St. Bartholomew's on an iron ring that seemed older than all of them. When he saw Eleanor climb out of the truck, his face changed by degrees rather than all at once. Well, he said after a moment. That took longer than I hoped and less long than I feared. Eleanor drew the shawl tighter around herself. You have always spoken like an unsent letter, Joel. He nodded as though accepting a familiar verdict. And you have always mistaken delay for refusal. Gideon stood back while the old loyalties and old irritations recognized one another. Joel led them around to the south side entrance, where the lock complained but gave way. Inside, the chapel smelled of wood, dust, old hymnals, and cold stone that had outlived generations of prayer without once warming to the arrangement. The main room was dim, but enough winter light slipped through the surviving panes to show what time had done and what it had spared. Gideon had seen the photographs in the library. They had not prepared him. Even unfinished, even dulled by dust and one boarded section on the east side, the glass still carried intention. Branch patterns climbed the lead lines like winter woods. Fragments of pale gold and blue held themselves in suspension. The missing center did not merely look incomplete. It looked like a sentence interrupted at the one word that would have made the rest of it bearable. Eleanor stopped 3 steps inside. Brass stood close at her knee but did not touch her. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Joel said, quietly enough for the room rather than the people in it, "I kept the east side covered because I couldn't stand to let weather finish what grief started." Eleanor closed her eyes once. When she opened them, she said, "That is almost unforgivably kind." "Almost," Joel agreed. The sound of another truck arriving broke the stillness. Tires over crusted snow. A door slamming harder than necessary. Mara looked toward the entrance. "That'll be Wade." Wade Fenner came in carrying a tool bag that seemed to have acquired its shape from years of being set down in practical places. He was broad through the shoulders, 60 if he was a day, with a reddish-gray beard trimmed without artistry and hands cracked white at the knuckles from cold and work. He had the expression of a man who trusted wood, metal, and stoves more than human timing, largely because the first 3 broke in ways you could point to. His eyes landed on Eleanor and then dropped, just briefly, to the floor. "Ma'am," he said. She lifted one brow. "Have I become a court proceeding?" "No," Wade muttered. "Just old enough to know when I'm late." There it was. Not a dramatic confession. Not a redemption speech. Just one man in a worn coat standing in a cold chapel admitting he had waited too long to show up. It changed the air more than apology might have. They spent the next hour not repairing anything yet, but measuring the shape of what repair would ask. Wade checked the south wall for drafts and the work tables in the side room Joel had kept covered. Joel fetched old storage crates. Mara made everyone eat half a sandwich before they were hungry enough to refuse one. Gideon moved benches, cleared space, and set up the room according to use rather than beauty, which had always been his most honest talent. Near mid-afternoon, while Joel searched for a surviving box of Kames strips, and Wade muttered over a warped frame, the chapel door opened again. A woman stepped in, wearing a dark blue coat and gloves the color of ash. She was near Eleanor's age, but where Eleanor looked pared down by solitude, this woman carried herself with the taut self-command of someone who had survived by staying indispensable. Her face was narrow, handsome in an unsentimental way, and her gray hair was pinned so severely it seemed to hold the rest of her upright by force. Irene Vale took 3 steps into the room and stopped. No one announced her. No one needed to. Eleanor turned. For a moment, Gideon had the odd impression that the entire chapel was listening. Not as building, not as symbol, simply as a place that had held too much human weather to mistake what was happening now. Irene's gaze moved from Eleanor to the east window and back again. "You still keep bad timing," she said. Eleanor's expression did not soften. Neither did it harden. It became something more difficult than either. "So do you," she replied. That was all. No reunion, no collapse, no theatrical bitterness spilling cleanly into the open. Just 2 older women in winter coats standing on either side of years no one had crossed, and in the middle of that distance, an unfinished window waiting like a witness too patient to die. Brass sat down between them, not choosing, not intruding, merely occupying the only honest position available to a creature who loved without politics. Gideon looked at the room. At Wade with his tool bag, Joel with his keys, Mara with her folded arms and tired kindness, Eleanor with her shawl and tin box, Irene with all that old precision still in place. This was no rescue. It was something slower, and therefore harder. The kind of work that asked not who was innocent, but who was willing to remain in the room long enough for truth to stop being avoidable. And for the first time since he had driven into Belle Crane under that polished morning light, Gideon felt the shape of a task that could not be solved by strength, speed, or competence alone. It would have to be carried. Together. By late afternoon, the light had changed. It was still bright, but not with the clean certainty Belle Crane wore on gentler winter days. The sky above St. Bartholomew's had gone the color of hammered pewter, and the snow outside the chapel no longer reflected light so much as held it in suspension. Wind moved low across the hill in hard, white sheets, not yet a storm in full, but no longer weather anyone sensible ignored. Inside, the side room off the chapel had acquired the untidy gravity of work beginning in earnest. Joel had found the old crates of cane and stacked them beneath the windows. Wade had propped 2 warped work tables on blocks to bring them level. Mara had claimed a corner for food and thermoses, as if kitchens were less places than states of mind she could impose anywhere with enough towels and irritation. Irene had removed her gloves with the same precise economy she likely once reserved for sacred things and laid out tools from a long canvas roll, glass pliers, grozing iron, fid, cutters, a soldering iron whose wooden handle had been darkened by years of use. Eleanor stood near the east panel with the tin box open beside her, its contents finally no longer hidden but not yet surrendered. Gideon moved where he was useful. That was how he understood rooms, not through emotion first but through load and access. What was unstable, what needed heat, what could be carried, where people would trip if no one changed the arrangement before exhaustion made fools of them all. He shifted a bench away from the draft line, secured a loose extension cord, moved the space heater farther from the old drapery hanging over a storage shelf, and checked the chapel door twice because the latch sat crooked in the frame, and he distrusted anything that looked sturdy without actually being so. Brass tracked him for a while, then abandoned him in favor of Eleanor. The dog stretched out beneath the edge of her work table, one ear angled toward the room, one toward the outer wall where the wind made itself known in dry bursts. He had not barked once since Irene arrived. Gideon suspected the dog understood something all of them were still pretending to discover. Noise would not help here. Presence might. Irene picked up one of the folded drawings from Eleanor's tin box and opened it flat beneath the lamp. The paper crackled softly. Gideon had expected sketches. What lay there was more like discipline made visible. The central roundel of the east window had been drawn in graphite and pale color notation, the lines sure but not showy. Water. Dawn. A curve of distant shore. Birch branches entering at the edges like witnesses too modest to steal the scene. Irene looked at it for a long moment before speaking. You changed the lower arc. Eleanor did not look at her. The first one was sentimental. It was luminous. It was sentimental, Eleanor repeated. That might have become an argument in another room, on another day. Here it simply announced that the language between them still existed, however dust-covered. Craft first, injury second, or buried underneath craft so deeply they had forgotten which had come before. Wade straightened from the window frame and rubbed one hand over his beard. If we're putting heat in this room for any real length of time, I need to patch that north seam before dark. Wind's getting under the sill. Joel glanced toward the chapel nave. The spare boards are in the old vestry closet. I'll get them, Gideon said. He moved through the chapel's main room with long strides made cautious by unfamiliar floorboards. The building had a different silence now than it had yesterday. Then it had felt suspended. Today it felt occupied, not by ghosts or memory in any theatrical sense, but by intention, tools, coats, breath. Human beings choosing, awkwardly and with mixed motives, to remain in one place, instead of carrying their separate griefs home and calling that wisdom. When he came back with the boards, the first snow had begun to strike the glass in fine, dry bursts. Wade took one look at the window and gave a low grunt. That's early. Joel set down the ledger he had been using to inventory what could still be salvaged. Forecast said after sunset. The forecast can apologize to the wall, Wade said. Mara, from the food corner, turned her head toward the sound as if Weather were an unruly customer who had just raised his voice. How bad? Wade went to the outer door, opened it a crack, and let the wind answer for him. Cold came through in a white sweep, sharp enough to make the lamp flame tremble. Snow was moving harder now, not falling prettily but traveling sideways. Bad enough, he said, shutting the door with his shoulder. If that center mock-up stays exposed overnight before we brace it proper, we lose alignment by morning. Maybe the panel too. That changed the room, not into panic. This group did not have the vanity for panic. But all at once, every person there began recalculating the work in front of them according to weather rather than preference. Time had ceased to be generous. Gideon saw Eleanor's hands still over the drawing, not shaking exactly, paused. He crossed to the work table. What can be done now? Irene answered before Eleanor could deflect. The centerpieces can be cut and set into provisional came if we work from the pattern and don't pretend perfection is possible before dark. Eleanor's mouth tightened. Provisional fitting in this temperature is reckless. Leaving the opening half-dressed is worse, Irene said. Mara came over with a lantern in one hand and set it down hard enough to announce that the room was no longer entitled to gentleness. Then stop arguing like the weather's waiting for old pride to make up its mind. Wade barked a laugh despite himself and headed back to the window seam with boards and hammer. Joel moved toward the fuse box in the hall. If the power goes, we've got the generator, but only for heat and one table lamp. Choose what matters. That was the redivision of the room. No speeches, no ceremonial agreement, just work rearranging itself under pressure. Gideon took the boards Wade handed him and braced the north seam, while the older man drove nails with quick, economical blows. Mara tore strips from an old blanket to stuff around the base of the drafty door. Joel cleared the far table and set out the best surviving lamp. Irene rolled her sleeves and positioned the tools. Eleanor stood still one beat longer, staring at the pattern for the east roundel as if whatever she had once lost there had just returned disguised as urgency. Then Brass rose and came to her side. He did not paw at her. He simply leaned once against her calf. It was the smallest gesture in the room. It changed everything. Eleanor exhaled. Fine, she said. Not to the dog, not to anyone, perhaps to the weather itself. We do the lower water field first. If that holds, the horizon line, the central light last. Irene nodded once, already reaching for the glass. The next hour moved with the compressed clarity of people too occupied to perform emotion. Gideon fed the stove in the side room, set up a second lamp, and held the wood brace steady whenever Wade needed both hands free. Mara portioned coffee into enamel cups no one remembered drinking until they were empty. Joel found a box of old pushpins and used them to secure the paper cartoon flat to the table. Irene scored and broke the larger pieces. Eleanor handled the color placement, the line of the cut, the impossible judgment between what the drawing had intended and what the remaining glass would allow. Outside, the storm gathered itself without drama and then arrived all at once. The chapel windows began to hiss under driven snow. Wind pressed the old structure in long, forceful breaths, testing every seam like a creditor. The hanging light in the nave swayed once, slightly, enough that Gideon saw it from the corner of his eye and disliked it on principle. Then the power failed. The room plunged into a brief, thick dark, followed immediately by Joel's voice from the hall. "Stay where you are." Lantern light bloomed, one, then another, warm and low, throwing the walls into amber half-shadow. Brass did not startle. He shifted position under Eleanor's table and stayed there, a darker shape inside the dark. Joel came back with the generator humming faintly to life outside. "One heater," he said. "One lamp, that's what we get." "Enough," Irene replied. It was not enough for comfort. It was enough for fidelity. Gideon had lived through more dangerous nights than this, but danger with a weapon or an extraction plan had edges he understood. This was older and stranger. A half-frozen chapel. A handful of aging people with layered griefs. A window no one could justify and no one could abandon. The stakes would have sounded ridiculous to anyone not inside the room, which was precisely why they mattered. About midway through the storm, Irene stopped with the soldering iron in her hand and looked at Eleanor across the lit table. "You left me to explain it alone." No one moved. There it was, not craft now, not weather. Eleanor did not pretend confusion. Yes. Irene set the iron down in its stand with too much care. They asked what happened to the center panel. They asked whether the church had overreached, whether the cost had been mismanaged, whether we'd exaggerated the damage after the annex fire. They asked as if the work itself had failed because no one wanted to say your husband had died, and you had gone silent and She broke off, angry with the break more than with the memory. "I had to stand there and make it all small enough for other people to tolerate." Mara froze by the stove. Joel looked at the floor. Wade, who had been tightening the brace near the door, straightened slowly but said nothing. Eleanor's face did not collapse. It closed 1 degree, then reopened in a different way. "I know," she said. "That's all." "No." Her voice was quiet, but every person in the room heard it. "It isn't all, it's simply true." Wind hit the chapel broadside with a forceful shudder. Snow rattled against the boarded panel and then moved on. Irene stared at her. "You think I was angry because you abandoned the work, weren't you?" Eleanor asked. "I was angry because you abandoned me inside it." The sentence entered the room like cold. For a long moment, none of the practical motions resumed. Gideon understood suddenly that he was standing inside a kind of battlefield no training had prepared him for. Not one made of enemies, but of old loyalties forced to stand in weather together until the truth stopped posing as politeness. Eleanor looked down at her hands. The lantern light was not kind to anyone. It showed age honestly, the thinning skin, the vein lines, the tremor held in check through will and habit. "When Thomas died," she said, "I could barely cross my own kitchen. That wasn't my accusation." "No," Eleanor said, "that was my explanation." The room remained still. Then, unexpectedly, Wade spoke from the door. "I should have checked your stove last week." Every head turned. He shrugged once, as if ashamed to find himself audible. I knew the cold front was coming. Knew that old unit had been complaining since November. Drove past twice. Told myself you'd call if it mattered. Told myself you hated people fussing. He looked at the floorboards. Truth is, I didn't feel like walking into a house full of history and finding out it still had sharper teeth than I did. Mara exhaled slowly through her nose. Joel rubbed one hand over the back of his neck. Nothing was solved by any of it. That was the irritating dignity of honesty. It did not perform resolution on cue. It simply made evasion more expensive. Brass left Eleanor's table then and crossed to Wade, not hurriedly, not to comfort, but with the same solemn directness he had used all week when deciding a human being required anchoring. He sat by Wade's boot and looked up. Wade blinked down at him. "What?" Brass characteristically declined to explain. The tension in the room loosened just enough for breath to return. Mara let out something dangerously close to a laugh. "Congratulations," she said. "You've been judged useful." Wade snorted despite himself, and the spell broke. Work resumed, not lightly, not happily, but with less pretense. Eleanor and Irene set the lower water pieces and came together. Their hands did not mirror one another exactly. Eleanor's still surer on color, Irene's steadier on fit, but they found the old rhythm in fragments. Joel read the pattern measurements aloud when the light got too dim to trust the markings. Gideon held the temporary frame square, while Wade fixed the final brace against the shifting wall. Mara moved through them all with coffee, cloths, and the quiet authority of someone who knew that people attempting difficult honesty often forgot they were also made of blood sugar and joints. By the time the storm began to weaken, the lower field of the central panel had been assembled. It was not beautiful yet. It was more impressive than beauty. The lead lines were provisional, the solder rough in places, the pieces not polished. But under the lamp, the blue-gray water held shape. The horizon line waited above it. Space had been claimed from emptiness. Outside, the wind dropped from assault to warning. Joel opened the door a crack and peered out into swirling white. "Not over," he said, "but the worst of this wave has passed." Nobody answered immediately. They were too tired for relief to look noble. Eleanor sat down at last on the bench beside the work table. One hand pressed lightly to the edge of the half-set panel. Irene stood opposite her, shoulders bowed not with weakness but with the cost of staying. Gideon remained at the frame until Wade told him he could let go without losing the alignment. Mara handed out the last of the sandwiches whether people wanted them or not. Brass returned to Eleanor and laid his head across her boot. She let her hand rest on his neck. Then, looking not at the dog but at the panel before her, she said quietly, "I had forgotten how much unfinished things weigh." No one contradicted her. The side room held the smell of hot metal, coffee, damp wool, and old wood beginning, against reason, to trust human hands again. Nothing had been redeemed. Nothing had been forgiven cleanly. But something had been kept from failing outright. And in a winter like this, that was not a small form of grace. The storm passed in the night without apology. By morning, Belle Crane had been remade in the plain, unsentimental way winter remade everything worth keeping. Snow lay deeper along the chapel steps and along the roofs of the houses below, smoothing some edges and revealing others. The lake beyond town was a broad sheet of white light under a pale sky, not frozen solid, not open either, caught in that in-between state where even water seemed to be deciding what it could endure. Inside St. Bartholomew's, the side room looked used in a way that felt almost holy. Coffee cups sat empty beside soldering irons gone cold. Folded rags had stiffened with old heat and dust. The temporary brace Wade had built into the east frame held firm. And on the central table, The lower field of the unfinished panel remained exactly where they had fought to keep it. Blue-gray water caught in provisional lead lines, unlovely, up close, and undeniable all the same. Gideon stood in the doorway of the workroom with one hand braced against the jamb, and understood, without ceremony, that something had shifted more permanently than any of them yet wanted to name. Not because the work was done, it wasn't. Not because anyone had reconciled cleanly, they hadn't, but because the room no longer felt like borrowed effort. It felt inhabited by intention. Brass came up beside him and leaned against his leg. "Yeah," Gideon said quietly. "I see it." Behind them, the main chapel door opened and shut with a muffled thud. Mara entered first, carrying a brown paper sack that smelled like warm bread and bacon, and the practical refusal to let a difficult morning go unfed. Joel followed with a broom and a look that suggested he had already made peace with spending half his winter maintaining a church no one could afford to use properly. Wade arrived 5 minutes later in the same coat as yesterday, only now powdered at the shoulders with snow, hauling a crate of old storm windows from somewhere Gideon had not thought to check. Irene came last and closed the door behind her with care, as if even now she did not trust herself with unnecessary noise. Eleanor was already there. She stood at the work table in Helen Sutter's wool socks, a long gray cardigan over her dress, and her hair pinned back more neatly than Gideon had yet seen it. She had not returned to the bus stop. She had not asked to be taken back to the car. She had spent the night in the small room behind Mara's storage hall and arrived at the chapel before almost everyone else, carrying her dented tin box in both hands like a woman reporting for something she had once failed and now intended, for reasons not entirely noble, to face again. Irene stopped across from her. Neither woman spoke at first. Then Eleanor slid the graphite sketch of the roundel across the table with 2 fingers and said, "The horizon is wrong." Irene bent over it. "No, the horizon is honest. The light above it is wrong." "Elaborate. It's too careful." Eleanor's mouth twitched almost imperceptibly. "That from you is nearly an insult. That from me is always an insult." It was the closest thing to ease they had managed yet. Mara, setting down breakfast on a bench, looked toward Gideon and murmured, "If they start speaking fluently in criticism again, we may survive this." He glanced at her. "Is that optimism?" "Absolutely not," she said. "It's pattern recognition." The morning found its shape from there. Wade fitted the salvaged storm windows against the inside of the side room openings to hold back drafts. Joel swept snowmelt from the chapel threshold and checked the generator fuel with the solemnity of a man who had once expected spiritual labor to be less mechanical than this. Mara turned the corner near the stove into a makeshift camp kitchen with thermoses, enamel mugs, hard-boiled eggs, and enough folded cloths to handle anything short of resurrection. Gideon moved through the work without needing to be told. He reinforced the brace, rerouted the extension cord, carried in more split wood, and repaired a loose hinge on the side room door because it had begun to complain every third swing, and he had reached the point in life where certain noises felt like personal accusation. Brass, meanwhile, appointed himself steward of morale in the least sentimental way possible. He followed Eleanor when she crossed the chapel floor. He stationed himself beneath Irene's chair when her hands tightened too long around a cutter. He blocked Wade from backing into a crate of lead came so effectively that the older man had to stop mid-step, look down and say, "You could have just let me ruin my spine like a gentleman." Brass, whose leadership style did not include explanation, remained where he was until Wade changed direction. Around midday, after 3 hours of work that was more patient than dramatic, Eleanor did something small enough that most towns would never have noticed, and large enough that Belle Crane, if it had any decency left, should have. She asked Mara for an extra chair, not for herself, for the far side of the table. "Who for?" Mara asked. Eleanor adjusted the placement of a paper pattern without looking up. Anyone old enough to sit without pretending standing is a virtue. Gideon glanced over. Mara did too, and for once she did not try to make the moment lighter. She simply nodded and went to fetch the chair. By 1 o'clock, 2 more people had come. Not important people in the hierarchy of towns, which meant they were probably important in the real one. The first was Mrs. Lorna Keach, widow of a machinist, 80 if she was a day, compact as a pocket knife, with a knitted hat pulled low and the suspicious expression of someone who had survived decades by assuming most invitations contained hidden administrative costs. She came because Mara had sent word through the diner that St. Bartholomew's needed steady hands for paper sorting, and someone had remembered Lorna once folded church bulletins with terrifying precision. The second was Arthur Bell, Joel's older cousin, who limped from an old farm injury and had the broad pink face of a man permanently irritated by weather, government, and chair legs. He brought nothing except his own presence and a pair of magnifying lenses from his workshop, muttering that if everybody was going to insist on restoring useless beauty, then somebody ought to at least see what they were doing. Eleanor did not greet them warmly. That was not her way. She greeted them functionally. "You may sort the blue glass by thickness," she told Lorna. "And you," she said to Arthur, "can tell us whether the lead line on panel C is drifting or whether Irene's eyes are finally unionizing." Arthur barked a surprised laugh. Irene looked offended on principle. Lorna sat down, put on her gloves, and began sorting the glass with the grim satisfaction of someone who had been assigned a job instead of pity. That was the rehook of the day, though none of them would have called it that. Eleanor had stopped enduring the room and begun using it. Not joyfully, not yet, but with authority. The atmosphere changed after that. Not lighter, more inhabited. Through the afternoon, Belle Crane entered the chapel in drips and increments. A gas station mechanic named Toby dropped off a box of old drop cloths and fled before anyone could thank him. Nora Bellum sent over archival copies of the original design notes with a penciled margin remark from 20 years earlier. Check winter tones against actual dawn, not memory, which made Irene close her eyes briefly, and Eleanor turn away before anyone could read her face. Helen Sutter herself came by for 10 minutes, ostensibly to inspect whether Eleanor was avoiding catastrophe, and actually to hand Mara a packet of pain relievers, a better pair of gloves, and a look that said, "Do not romanticize this." No one did. That was perhaps the strangest grace of all. Belle Crane did not suddenly become a town of saints. It became a town where a few people, late and imperfectly, had stopped pretending not to notice. By late afternoon, the central roundel had advanced farther than anyone had expected. The lower water field held. The horizon line had been revised twice, argued over 3 times, and finally accepted with the exhausted authority of compromise earned rather than imposed. A first section of the upper light had been cut but not yet set. Under the lamps, the unfinished glass no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a promise still negotiating terms with reality. Gideon stepped outside once to split more wood, and found the air softer than it had been in days. Not warm. Belle Crane did not waste itself on delusion, but less brutal. The sky had opened into a washed blue, and the long white road out of town lay visible all the way to the bend, where it turned south toward the interstate. He stood with the axe in hand and looked at it. That road had defined him for years. Not adventure, not freedom exactly, more like exemption. So long as he was in motion, no place could ask what portion of him belonged to it. No person could tell the difference between service and evasion if he kept both polished to the same shine. The back door of the chapel opened behind him. Eleanor stepped out in her cardigan and coat, the tin box tucked under one arm. Brass came with her and sat immediately between them, as if assuming all meaningful conversations required a witness with fur. "You've been glaring at the highway," Eleanor said. "It's very unbecoming." He rested the axe head against the chopping block. "I was thinking. Dangerous at your age. I'm older than I look." "No," she said. "You look exactly like a man who has spent too long carrying useful things instead of honest ones." The line struck clean. Not because it was cruel, because it was accurate in a way he had been circling without wanting named. He looked out over the white fields. "I'm staying." Eleanor said nothing, not because she had not heard him, because she had. He went on before he could turn the sentence into something more temporary and therefore less true. "At least through the winter. Maybe until your cabin is habitable again. Wade can't do the outside boards alone if the freeze lifts. Joel needs help here. Mara needs somebody to carry what she pretends isn't heavy, and Belle Crane apparently keeps inventing reasons not to let me leave." That last part almost invited humor, but neither of them took it. Eleanor tightened her hold on the box. "You should not build your life around other people's unfinished work." He let out a breath that was nearly a laugh and not at all a defense. "Too late for that." Brass lifted his head toward him. The dog's muzzle had more gray in it than when the week began. Gideon noticed things like that, the slow evidences, the increments nobody dramatic wrote songs about. Eleanor looked toward the east side of the chapel where the window waited. "I used to think courage meant enduring what happened," she said. "Then I thought it meant paying for it." She paused. "I'm beginning to suspect it may mean staying where it happened long enough to make something else true." He turned that over. Below them, the town had begun to light itself for evening. One porch lamp, then another. A grocery truck turning toward Maine. Thin smoke from chimneys, all of it rendered beautiful by distance and therefore slightly dishonest. "I don't know if I'm built for staying," he said. Eleanor adjusted the cardigan at her shoulders. "No one is. They become it by remaining badly until they learn to do it less badly." For the first time in several days, Gideon smiled without resistance. Back inside, the lamps were on. Mara was arguing with Arthur about whether overboiled eggs counted as food or punishment. Irene had found a better angle for the upper light and was pretending the idea had been hers all along. Lorna Keach was sorting cane strips with the severe concentration of a woman who finally had something useful to disapprove of. Joel stood under the chapel arch, listening to the room, as if he could hear, beneath the tools and voices, the old building deciding whether to trust them. Brass rose and trotted back in first. Gideon held the door for Eleanor, and this time she did not bristle at the gesture. She stepped through with the tin box in her arms and the bearing of someone not healed, not absolved, but no longer absent from her own life. The chapel took her in without spectacle. For the rest of the evening they worked, not heroically, not in montage-worthy harmony. Arthur complained about his knees. Mara burned one batch of toast and denied it. Irene corrected Joel's measurements twice, and once unfairly. Wade returned from Eleanor's cabin with a list of repairs longer than anyone liked and shorter than Gideon had feared. Helen came back only long enough to make sure Eleanor sat down every hour and then vanished before gratitude could get organized. The work moved the way real restoration moved, unevenly, stubbornly, with repetition mistaken by outsiders for lack of progress. But by dusk, the roundel carried more light than it had that morning. And when everyone finally began packing away tools, blowing out lamps and arguing mildly about who would come back first thing tomorrow, Eleanor remained by the east panel a moment longer than the others. She rested one hand against the lead edge of the unfinished circle. "I had thought," she said, not turning, "that belonging again would feel cleaner than this." No one answered immediately. Then Joel, from near the door, said in his dry clerical voice, "Most holy things are untidy up close." Mara snorted. Irene looked offended by the theology, but not enough to contest it. Snorted. Irene looked offended by the theology, but not enough to contest it. Wade shrugged like a man who believed in boards more than metaphors, and yet saw no reason to object. Gideon said nothing because, for once, silence felt less like evasion than witness. Brass came to stand at Eleanor's side. She let her hand drop to the dog's neck. Together, framed by lamplight in the unfinished dawn in glass, they looked not like an ending, but like the first honest shape of one. And as Gideon watched the chapel gather its people, its dust, its tools, and its difficult little island of warmth against another Montana night, he understood that home, when it returned at all, did not return as a trumpet call or a clean forgiveness. Sometimes it returned as a room that no longer let you disappear inside it. Sometimes it returned as work. Sometimes it returned because a dog refused to stand watch anywhere else. This story reminds us that not every home is built from walls alone. Sometimes home returns when someone chooses not to walk away, when a wounded heart dares to stay, and when grace arrives in small, ordinary forms. A warm room, a steady hand, a faithful dog, a light that is slowly restored. And sometimes that is how God works too, not always through grand miracles, but through quiet mercy, patient people, and the courage to remain where love is still needed. In everyday life, many people are carrying unfinished things inside them. A grief, a regret, a silence they have lived with so long it feels like part of the furniture. This story asks us not to look away too quickly. Sometimes the smallest act of staying, listening, or helping can become the first real step toward healing. If this story stayed with you, share in the comments what touched your heart most. And if you believe stories of hope, dignity, and quiet grace still matter, please subscribe and stay with us for the next one. May God give peace to every tired heart, warmth to every lonely home, and gentle light for whatever in your life still feels unfinished.